Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. Growing up in a small military town near Camp Pendleton, she was surrounded by tough Marines and their families. Her father, Sergeant Major Rodriguez, had served 3 tours overseas before settling into training new recruits. From a young age, Sarah watched these warriors come and go, their discipline and strength becoming the backdrop of her childhood. At 17, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with dark hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her build was slight, almost delicate, which often led people to underestimate her. She had learned early on that being the daughter of a military man meant expectations were high, but being small and female in a world of large, muscular Marines meant those expectations often came with doubt. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning in March. Sarah was running late for her job at the base commissary, where she worked part-time after school to save money for college. She had dreams of studying engineering, following in the footsteps of her older brother who had graduated from West Point 2 years earlier. As she hurried down the concrete steps outside her apartment building, her foot caught on a loose piece of metal that had worked its way up through a crack in the step. The fall was awkward and painful. Sarah's instinct was to break her fall with her right hand, but the angle was wrong. She heard the snap before she felt the pain, a sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Her wrist bent at an impossible angle, and immediately she knew something was seriously wrong. Mrs. Chun from the apartment next door heard Sarah's cry and rushed outside. The elderly woman had lived on military bases most of her life, following her Navy husband from station to station, and she had seen plenty of injuries over the years. One look at Sarah's hand told her this was no minor sprain. The emergency room at the base hospital was busy that morning. A training exercise had gone wrong, and several Marines were being treated for various injuries. Sarah sat in the waiting area, cradling her obviously broken wrist, trying not to show how much pain she was in. Around her, the injured Marines joked and laughed despite their own wounds, displaying the kind of tough mentality that was drilled into them from their first day of basic training. Dr. Patterson, the orthopedic surgeon on duty, examined Sarah's x-rays with a concerned expression. The break was complex, involving both the radius and ulna bones in her forearm. What made it particularly problematic was the way the bones had shifted, creating what he called a significant displacement. The injury would require surgery to properly align the bones and install metal plates to hold everything in place during healing. Sarah's father arrived at the hospital still wearing his training uniform, sweat stains visible from the morning's drill exercises. Sergeant Major Rodriguez was a man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, but seeing his daughter in pain brought a different kind of worry to his weathered face. He listened carefully as Dr. Patterson explained the surgery and the long recovery process that would follow. The operation took nearly 3 hours. Sarah woke up in recovery with her right arm encased in a heavy cast that extended from just below her elbow to her knuckles. The metal plates and screws that now held her bones together made the cast feel impossibly heavy. Dr. Patterson explained that she would need to wear the cast for at least 8 weeks, followed by months of physical therapy to regain full use of her hand. For someone who had always been active and independent, the limitations imposed by the cast were immediately frustrating. Sarah was right-handed, and suddenly, simple tasks like writing, eating, or even getting dressed became major challenges. Her father helped her adapt their apartment, moving frequently used items to places where she could reach them with her left hand, but the adjustment was difficult for both of them. Returning to school the following week was when the real problems began. Sarah had always been a good student, but taking notes with her non-dominant hand was nearly impossible. Her handwriting, normally neat and precise, became an illegible scrawl that even she couldn't read later. Teachers were understanding at first, offering extensions on assignments and allowing her to type papers instead of writing them by hand, but the accommodations made her feel different and weak. The comments from classmates started small. Someone would make a joke about her broken wing or ask if she needed help opening her locker. Sarah tried to laugh along, understanding that most of the teasing was harmless, but as days turned into weeks, the jokes became more pointed and less friendly. Jake Morrison was the worst of them. A senior whose father was a Marine colonel, Jake had grown up with even more military influence than Sarah, but, unlike her, he had embraced the aggressive, dominating aspects of that culture. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a kind of natural athleticism that made him a star on the football team and popular with many of his classmates. Jake seemed to take particular pleasure in highlighting Sarah's temporary disability. he would accidentally bump into her injured arm in the hallways, then apologize with exaggerated concern. During lunch, he would make loud comments about how some people couldn't handle even minor injuries, comparing Sarah's situation to his own football injuries that he claimed never slowed him down. The breaking point came during a particularly difficult day in chemistry class. Sarah was struggling to hold her textbook open with one hand while trying to take notes with the other. The cast made it impossible to position the book properly, and she kept losing her place as the heavy cover flopped closed. Her frustration was building when Jake, who sat 2 seats behind her, began providing a running commentary. "Wow, reading is hard when you only have one working hand," he said loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "Maybe Martinez should ask for a coloring book instead. Those are easier to manage." Several students laughed, and Sarah felt her face burn with embarrassment. She tried to focus on the teacher's lecture about molecular bonds, but Jake wasn't finished. "I heard they give participation trophies now for people who can't even hold a pencil properly," he continued. "Maybe that's what you need, Martinez. A special award for showing up to class despite your devastating injury." Sarah's left hand gripped her pencil so tightly that the wood began to crack. She had endured weeks of similar comments, always trying to take the high road, always trying to prove she could handle the situation with grace. But something about Jake's tone, the way he said devastating injury, with such obvious sarcasm, pushed her past her breaking point. She turned around in her seat to face him, her dark eyes flashing with anger. "At least when my arm heals, I'll still be smarter than you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. Jake's expression darkened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as weak and vulnerable. "What did you say to me?" The chemistry teacher, Mr. Williams, looked up from his notes and noticed the tension in the room. "Is there a problem back there?" "No problem," Jake said with a fake smile. "Martinez was just telling me about her injury. I was trying to be supportive." Sarah wanted to tell Mr. Williams the truth, but she knew it would only make things worse. Teachers couldn't be everywhere, and Jake would find other ways to continue his harassment. Instead, she turned back around and tried to focus on the lesson, but the damage was done. The incident had escalated their conflict to a new level. After class, Jake made sure to walk close behind Sarah as they left the room. "You think you're tough, Martinez?" he whispered just loud enough for her to hear. "You're nothing. You're weak, and everyone knows it. Your broken hand just proves what we all already knew about you." That afternoon, Sarah sat in her bedroom staring at the cast that had become the symbol of her temporary helplessness. The white plaster was already dirty and scuffed from weeks of wear, covered with signatures from friends and well-wishers who had tried to make the best of her situation. But all she could see now was how the cast represented everything she felt she had lost. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her best friend Maria, asking if she wanted to go to the movies that weekend. Sarah stared at the message for several minutes before typing back that she wasn't feeling well. The truth was, she didn't want to go anywhere public where people might stare at her cast or, worse, where she might run into Jake and his friends. That night at dinner, her father noticed her unusual quietness. Sergeant Major Rodriguez had dealt with enough young Marines to recognize when someone was struggling with more than just physical challenges. He set down his fork and looked at his daughter with the kind of direct attention that had made him an effective leader. "You want to tell me what's really bothering you?" he asked. Sarah considered deflecting the question, telling him everything was fine, but the weight of weeks of frustration and embarrassment suddenly felt too heavy to carry alone. She told him about Jake's constant comments, about feeling weak and helpless, about how the cast had somehow become a target for every insecurity she had ever felt about herself. Her father listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as Sarah described the daily harassment she had been enduring. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "You know, Mija, some of the strongest Marines I ever served with were the ones who had to overcome the biggest challenges," he said finally. "Strength isn't about never getting hurt. It's about what you do when you are hurt." Sarah appreciated her father's attempt to help, but she wasn't sure she believed him. How could she be strong when she couldn't even open a jar of peanut butter without help? Over the following days, Jake's harassment intensified. He seemed emboldened by Sarah's confrontation in chemistry class, taking it as proof that he was getting under her skin. He began recruiting other students to join in his mockery, turning Sarah's cast into a source of entertainment for a growing group of followers. During lunch, Jake would loudly discuss how handicapped people deserved special treatment, speaking in a tone that made it clear he thought such treatment was undeserved weakness. In the hallways, he would pretend to protectively clear a path for Sarah, calling out warnings about fragile cargo coming through. The worst incident happened on a Friday afternoon as Sarah was trying to get books from her locker. The combination lock required 2 hands to operate effectively, and she was struggling with the awkward process of holding the lock steady while turning the dial with her left hand. Jake appeared beside her with several of his friends, all of them large, athletic boys who seemed to enjoy having an audience for their leader's entertainment. "Need some help there, Martinez?" Jake asked with false concern. "I know operating complex machinery can be challenging for people with disabilities." "I'm fine," Sarah said through gritted teeth, finally managing to open the lock. "Are you sure?" Jake pressed. "Because I was thinking maybe we should set up a charity fund. You know, to help pay for special equipment for people who can't handle normal activities anymore." His friends laughed, and Sarah felt her face burning with humiliation. Several other students had stopped to watch the interaction, some looking uncomfortable, but none willing to intervene. Sarah grabbed her books with her left hand and tried to walk away, but Jake wasn't finished. "Hey, where are you going?" he called after her. "I was just trying to help. Don't you want our charity?" Sarah kept walking, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and shame. Behind her, she could hear Jake and his friends laughing, and she knew the story would spread throughout the school by Monday. She was becoming known not as Sarah Martinez, good student and daughter of a respected Marine, but as the girl who couldn't handle a broken bone. That weekend, Sarah found herself avoiding her usual activities. She didn't want to see anyone from school, didn't want to face any more pitying looks or helpful offers that made her feel even more helpless. She spent most of Saturday in her room, alternating between anger at Jake and frustration with herself for letting his words affect her so deeply. On Sunday morning, her father knocked on her bedroom door. When she didn't answer immediately, he entered anyway, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on her nightstand and sat down in the chair beside her desk. "You've been hiding in here for almost 2 days," he observed. "That doesn't seem like you." Sarah sat up in bed, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warm mug felt good in her left hand, and the familiar ritual of morning coffee with her father brought a small measure of comfort. "Dad, how do you handle people who think you're weak?" she asked. Sergeant Major Rodriguez smiled slightly. "You mean like the young Marines who think they can intimidate their drill instructor?" "Something like that." "Well," he said, settling back in his chair, "I've learned that the people who work hardest to make others feel weak are usually the ones who are most insecure about their own strength. But, more importantly, I've learned that real strength isn't about what other people think of you. It's about what you think of yourself." Sarah considered this, but she wasn't sure she understood what he meant. How could she think of herself as strong when she felt so helpless? "The thing is, Mija, you're going to face challenges in life that are much bigger than a broken bone," her father continued. "And how you handle this challenge is going to teach you something important about who you are. You can let these bullies convince you that you're weak, or you can prove to yourself that you're stronger than any injury." As Sunday evening approached, Sarah found herself dreading Monday morning and another week of Jake's harassment. She tried to imagine different ways to handle the situation, but every scenario seemed to end with her looking weak or helpless. She was beginning to understand that the real problem wasn't her broken hand at all. The real problem was that she had started believing Jake's version of who she was. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the military base settling into evening quiet, Sarah made a decision. She couldn't control what had happened to her hand, and she couldn't control what Jake Morrison chose to say about it. But she could control how she responded to both challenges. Her cast would come off eventually, but the person she chose to be in response to this adversity would stay with her forever. She didn't know yet exactly what she was going to do, but for the first time in weeks, Sarah Martinez felt like she had some control over her situation. And that small sense of control was the beginning of something much larger than she could have imagined. Monday morning arrived with the usual bustle of military life. Sarah woke to the sound of reveille echoing across the base, a sound that had marked the beginning of every day since she was old enough to remember. But this Monday felt different somehow. The determination she had found Sunday night still burned quietly inside her, like a small flame that refused to be extinguished by doubt or fear. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would be easy to manage with one hand, but that also made her feel confident. The cast still felt heavy and awkward on her right arm, but she tried to see it differently now. Instead of a symbol of weakness, Maybe it could be proof of her ability to adapt and overcome. At school, Jake Morrison was waiting for her at her locker, as if he had made torturing Sarah Martinez a part of his daily routine. His usual group of followers stood nearby, ready to laugh at whatever entertainment their leader had planned for the morning. "Well, look who decided to show up," Jake announced loudly. "I was starting to worry that our favorite invalid had given up on education entirely." Sarah took a deep breath and focused on opening her locker. She had practiced the combination over the weekend, finding a technique that worked better with her left hand. She wouldn't give Jake the satisfaction of watching her struggle. "You know, Martinez," Jake continued, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I've come up with some career suggestions. Maybe you could be a professional victim, or a poster child for workplace safety. I bet there's good money in being professionally helpless." For the first time in weeks, Sarah didn't feel the familiar surge of anger and humiliation at Jake's words. Instead, she found herself analyzing his behavior with the kind of detached curiosity her father had taught her to apply to difficult problems. Jake needed an audience for his cruelty, and he needed Sarah to react with visible pain or anger to fuel his performance. She turned to face him calmly. "Jake, do you always work this hard to get attention from girls? Or am I special?" The question caught him off guard. Several students who had gathered to watch the usual harassment laughed, but this time they were laughing at Jake, not Sarah. His face reddened slightly, and Sarah could see that he wasn't used to his target fighting back verbally. "I'm not trying to get attention from you," he said, his voice losing some of its confident mockery. "I'm just pointing out the obvious." "The obvious?" Sarah asked, still maintaining her calm tone. "What's obvious to me is that you spend a lot of time thinking about me. That's actually kind of flattering." More students laughed, and Jake's discomfort became more visible. Sarah grabbed her books and walked away, leaving Jake standing at her locker with his mouth slightly open and his audience beginning to disperse. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she had won a small victory. The feeling didn't last long. By lunchtime, word had spread about Sarah's verbal sparring with Jake, and she could feel the tension building. Jake Morrison was not the kind of person who accepted public embarrassment gracefully, and Sarah suspected he would escalate his behavior in response to being challenged. She was right. During lunch, Jake made a point of walking past her table multiple times, each time making increasingly loud comments about people who think they're tougher than they really are and fake confidence from broken people. His friends joined in, creating a chorus of mockery that drew attention from the entire cafeteria. Sarah tried to ignore them, focusing on her conversation with Maria and her other friends, but she could feel the familiar anger building inside her. The small victory from the morning was being erased by Jake's renewed assault on her dignity. After school, Sarah found herself walking slower than usual toward the commissary where she worked. The job had become another source of frustration since her injury. Tasks that had been simple before now required creative solutions or help from coworkers. She had to ask customers to help her bag their groceries, and she couldn't lift heavy items without assistance. Every day at work reinforced the limitations that Jake Morrison seemed so eager to highlight. Mrs. Chun was waiting for her outside the apartment building when Sarah returned home that evening. The elderly woman had been keeping an eye on Sarah since the accident, often stopping by to check if she needed help with anything. Today, however, she seemed to have something specific on her mind. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Chun said, falling into step beside her as they approached the building entrance. "I wanted to talk to you about something I've been noticing." Sarah paused, wondering if Mrs. Chun had heard about the problems at school. Military-based communities were small, and news traveled quickly between families. "I've been watching you these past few weeks," Mrs. Chun continued, "and I can see that you're struggling with more than just your broken hand." Sarah felt her defenses rising. The last thing she wanted was another adult treating her like she was fragile or unable to handle her own problems. "I'm fine, Mrs. Chun. Really." The older woman smiled knowingly. "My dear, I've lived on military bases for over 40 years. I've seen strong people face all kinds of challenges, and I've learned to recognize when someone is fighting a battle on multiple fronts." They had reached the entrance to their building, but Mrs. Chin showed no signs of ending the conversation. Instead, she gestured for Sarah to sit with her on the small bench beside the door. "When I was about your age," Mrs. Chin said, settling onto the bench with a slight groan, "I lived in a neighborhood where being Chinese made me different from everyone else. This was during the 1960s, mind you, when people weren't always as accepting as they pretend to be now." Sarah sat down beside her, curious despite her desire to escape to her apartment. There was a group of girls at my school who made it their mission to remind me every day that I didn't belong. They mocked my appearance, my accent, my family's customs. They made me feel like being different was the same as being weak. What did you do? Sarah asked. Mrs. Chin smiled. For a long time, I tried to make myself smaller. I thought if I could just avoid their attention, the problem would go away. But bullies don't leave you alone because you try to hide. They leave you alone when you show them that their attacks can't diminish who you are. But how do you do that when you actually are limited? Sarah asked, gesturing at her caste. Oh, sweetheart, Mrs. Chun said with a gentle laugh. You think that caste makes you weak? Let me tell you something about weakness and strength. Mrs. Chin stood up and rolled up the sleeve of her left arm, revealing a long, jagged scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. I got this scar when I was 19, she said. A drunk driver hit the bus I was riding, and a piece of metal nearly severed my arm. The doctor said I might never regain full use of it. Sarah stared at the scar, which was much more dramatic than anything her own injury would leave behind. For months, I couldn't use that arm for much of anything. I had to relearn how to write, how to cook, how to do dozens of small tasks that I had never thought about before. And, yes, there were people who saw my limitation as an opportunity to treat me as less capable than I really was. Did it get better? Sarah asked. The arm? Yes, mostly. I regained about 90% of my function after a lot of hard work. But, more importantly, I learned something about myself during that recovery period that changed how I saw every challenge that came after it. Mrs. Chin sat back down and turned to face Sarah directly. I learned that real strength isn't about never needing help. It's about having the courage to keep moving forward even when the path is more difficult than you expected. It's about refusing to let temporary limitations define your permanent worth. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over, but she managed to keep them in check. Mrs. Chin's words resonated with something deep inside her that she had been trying to ignore. The people who mock you for being temporarily limited, Mrs. Chin continued, they're revealing their own fear of vulnerability. They're so terrified of appearing weak themselves that they have to attack anyone who reminds them that strength and weakness can exist in the same person. That evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table trying to complete her chemistry homework with her left hand. The problems were complex, requiring detailed calculations and careful note-taking. With her dominant hand in a cast, the work took 3 times longer than usual, and her handwriting was barely legible. Her father came home from his evening training session and found her surrounded by crumpled papers and textbooks, her face set in determined concentration. How's it going? He asked, setting his gear bag by the door. Slowly, Sarah admitted, but I'm getting it done. Sergeant Major Rodriguez sat down across from her and watched as she worked through a particularly difficult problem. Her left-handed writing was getting better with practice, and her problem-solving approach had become more methodical and careful. You know what I'm noticing? He said after several minutes. That my handwriting looks like a 5-year-old's. Sarah asked with a tired smile. No, I'm noticing that this injury has forced you to slow down and really think through each step of what you're doing. Your work is actually more thorough than it used to be. Sarah looked up from her homework, surprised by his observation. Before the accident, her father continued, you used to rush through assignments, relying on your natural ability to carry you through. Now you have to be more intentional about everything you do. That's actually making you better at problem solving, not worse. Sarah had never thought about her injury in those terms before. She had been so focused on what she couldn't do that she hadn't noticed the new skills she was developing. There's something else, her father said. I've been hearing some things about problems you're having at school. Sarah's stomach dropped. She had hoped to keep her conflicts with Jake private, not wanting to burden her father with teenage drama. Dad, I can handle it, she said quickly. I'm sure you can, he replied. But that doesn't mean you should have to handle it alone. Sarah set down her pencil and looked at her father. His expression was serious, but not angry, and she realized he wasn't planning to intervene directly. He was offering support, not taking over. What would you do? She asked. In my experience, Sergeant Major Rodriguez said carefully, bullies continue their behavior as long as it serves a purpose for them. When that behavior stops giving them what they want, they usually move on to easier targets. But what if fighting back just makes things worse? Fighting back doesn't always mean fighting, Mija. Sometimes it means changing the rules of the game so that the bully can't win anymore. Sarah thought about this conversation as she prepared for bed that night. Both Mrs. Chun and her father had suggested that her approach to Jake's harassment needed to change, but neither had told her exactly what to do. They seemed to believe she was capable of finding her own solution. Tuesday brought a new escalation in Jake's campaign against Sarah. He had apparently spent Monday evening recruiting additional allies, because when Sarah arrived at school, she found herself facing not just Jake and his usual group, but several other students who seemed eager to join in the entertainment. During morning break, Jake organized what he called a charity drive for Sarah. He and his followers made a show of collecting coins from other students, claiming they were raising money to help disabled students afford special equipment. The performance was designed to maximize Sarah's humiliation, turning her injury into a public spectacle. Sarah watched the display from across the courtyard, feeling the familiar mixture of anger and shame that Jake's behavior always triggered. But this time, she also felt something new, a cold, analytical clarity that reminded her of her father's approach to tactical problems. Jake needed an audience to validate his cruelty, and he needed Sarah to react with visible distress to fuel his performance. What would happen if she removed one or both of those elements from his equation? At lunchtime, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of sitting with her usual friends, she walked directly to the table where Jake and his followers typically held court. The conversations around the table stopped as she approached, and Jake looked up with genuine surprise. Well, he said, recovering quickly from his shock. Look who's decided to join the popular table. Are you here to thank us for our charity drive this morning? Sarah pulled out an empty chair and sat down without being invited. The move was so unexpected that even Jake's friends seemed uncertain about how to respond. Actually, Sarah said calmly, I'm here to make you an offer. An offer? Jake laughed, but Sarah could hear uncertainty in his voice. This wasn't following his usual script. I know you've been working really hard to entertain people with jokes about my broken hand, Sarah continued, her voice steady and conversational. But I think we could do better. Jake's friends exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the response they were used to seeing from their leaders' targets. What are you talking about? Jake asked. Well, you've been putting a lot of energy into this, and, frankly, the material is getting stale. Broken hand jokes are pretty one-dimensional. But I have an idea for something that might be more interesting. Sarah had everyone's attention now, including students at neighboring tables who were straining to hear the conversation. What if, instead of focusing on what I can't do with one hand, we focused on what I can do? I'm willing to bet that even with this cast, I can outperform you in any physical or mental challenge you want to propose. The courtyard had gone almost completely quiet. Students throughout the area had stopped their own conversations to listen to this unexpected confrontation. Jake's face was beginning to show signs of the confusion he was feeling. Sarah's calm confidence was disrupting his ability to maintain control of the situation. You want to challenge me? He asked, his voice rising slightly. I'm suggesting we put your theory to the test, Sarah replied evenly. You seem to believe that having a broken bone makes someone weak and helpless. I think you're wrong. So let's find out who's right. Jake looked around the table at his friends, clearly seeking support for his position, but their expressions showed more curiosity than loyalty. The idea of an actual competition was more interesting than watching Jake torment someone who couldn't fight back. What kind of challenge? One of his friends asked. Sarah smiled, realizing that she had successfully shifted the dynamic of the entire interaction. Instead of being Jake's victim, she had become an equal participant in a competition. That's up to Jake, she said. He's the one who's been claiming I'm limited by my injury. Let him choose how he wants to prove it. Jake was trapped. If he refused the challenge, he would look like a coward in front of his followers. If he accepted it, he would be legitimizing Sarah as an equal opponent rather than a helpless victim. Fine, he said finally, his voice tight with anger. Let's see how tough you really think you are. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period. But the conversation at Jake's table had created a buzz of excitement that followed students back to their afternoon classes. Word spread quickly that Sarah Martinez had challenged Jake Morrison to some kind of competition, and by the end of the school day, dozens of students were speculating about what form the challenge might take. Sarah walked home that afternoon with a mixture of satisfaction and nervousness. She had successfully disrupted Jake's pattern of harassment, but she had also committed herself to a confrontation whose outcome was far from certain. Her challenge had been based on instinct and desperation rather than any carefully thought-out plan. That evening, she told her father about the day's events. Sergeant Major Rodriguez listened with interest as Sarah described her decision to confront Jake directly. So what's your plan now? He asked when she finished her account. I honestly don't know, Sarah admitted. I was hoping maybe you could help me figure that out. Her father smiled. You've already figured out the most important part. You've changed the terms of engagement. Instead of letting him define you as a victim, you've forced him to see you as an opponent. But what if I can't actually beat him in whatever challenge he chooses? Sarah asked. What if this just gives him a bigger platform to humiliate me? Then, you'll have learned something important about taking risks, her father said. But I suspect you're underestimating yourself. You've been adapting and overcoming challenges for weeks now. You're stronger than you were before your injury, not weaker. Sarah wasn't sure she believed that yet, but she was beginning to understand that strength might not be what she had always thought it was. Tomorrow, she would find out exactly what Jake Morrison thought would prove his point about her limitations. And then, she would discover what she was really capable of when everything was on the line. Wednesday morning arrived with an electric tension that seemed to pulse through the hallways of the school. Word of Sarah's challenge to Jake Morrison had spread beyond their immediate social circles, and students who normally paid no attention to either of them were now invested in the outcome of their confrontation. The anticipation was palpable, creating an undercurrent of excitement that teachers noticed but couldn't quite identify. Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way that was completely unfamiliar. Students she barely knew nodded at her in the hallways or offered words of encouragement. Others looked at her with curiosity, as if they were seeing her for the first time. The girl who had been invisible except as a target for Jake's mockery had suddenly become someone worth watching. Jake Morrison, meanwhile, seemed to be feeling the pressure of having to deliver on his reputation. He had spent Tuesday evening consulting with his friends about what kind of challenge would definitively prove Sarah's weakness while showcasing his own superiority. The problem was that any physical competition would now be viewed by the entire school as a test of his character as much as his ability. During first period, Sarah's chemistry teacher, Mr. Williams, pulled her aside after class. He had obviously heard about the brewing conflict and was concerned about where it might lead. Sarah, I understand you're dealing with some interpersonal issues with another student, he said carefully. I want you to know that if you need any adult support, I'm here to help. Sarah appreciated his concern, but she also understood that adult intervention would undermine everything she was trying to accomplish. If teachers solved this problem for her, Jake would simply wait until they weren't around to resume his harassment. Thank you, Mr. Williams, she said. I think I can handle this, but I'll let you know if I need help. He looked skeptical, but didn't press the issue. Sarah could see that he, like many of the adults in her life, was struggling to balance his desire to protect her with his recognition that she needed to learn to fight her own battles. At lunchtime, Jake made his announcement. He had chosen what he believed would be the perfect challenge to expose Sarah's limitations while demonstrating his own physical superiority. He stood up at his usual table and spoke loudly enough for most of the cafeteria to hear. Martinez wants to prove she's not limited by her broken hand, he announced. So here's the deal. Tomorrow after school, we're going to settle this with a real test of strength and skill. The cafeteria had gone quiet, with conversations stopping at tables throughout the room. Jake seemed to enjoy having such a large audience for his performance. We're going to have a competition, he continued. Multiple events that will test different kinds of ability. And, just to make it interesting, I'm going to bring some friends to help demonstrate what real strength looks like. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had expected a one-on-one challenge, not some kind of group competition where she would be outnumbered. What kind of events? She asked, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. Jake smiled with obvious satisfaction. Physical challenges, strength tests, the kind of things that show what people are really made of, unless you're having second thoughts. Sarah could feel the eyes of the entire cafeteria on her. This was the moment where she could back down, admit that she had overestimated her abilities, and return to being Jake's victim. Or she could commit fully to a path that might lead to even greater humiliation than anything she had experienced so far. I'm not having second thoughts, she said, standing up from her own table. What time and where? 4 o'clock, behind the gym, Jake replied. And Martinez? Bring whoever you want to watch you lose. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Sarah tried to focus on her classes, but her mind kept returning to Jake's words about bringing friends to help demonstrate real strength. She was beginning to understand that she had stumbled into something much larger than a simple competition between two students. After school, Sarah walked home slowly, trying to prepare herself mentally for whatever Jake had planned. She found Mrs. Chun working in the small garden beside their apartment building, tending to the vegetables she grew in neat, organized rows. You look like someone with a lot on her mind, Mrs. Chun observed, setting down her watering can. Sarah told her about Jake's challenge, and her growing anxiety about what she had gotten herself into. Mrs. Chen listened thoughtfully, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. "It sounds like this young man is planning to make a spectacle," Mrs. Chen said when Sarah finished her account. "He wants to humiliate you in front of an audience to establish his dominance." "I'm starting to think I made a mistake," Sarah admitted. "Maybe I should just not show up." Mrs. Chen studied her with the kind of penetrating look that seemed to see past surface concerns to deeper truths. "Tell me something, Sarah. What is it that you're really afraid of?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I'm afraid of losing. Of looking weak in front of everyone. Of proving that Jake was right about me all along. And what would happen if all of those things came true?" Mrs. Chun asked gently. "I guess I would still be the same person I was before," Sarah said slowly. "It would be embarrassing, but it wouldn't actually change who I am." "Exactly. And what if you discovered that you were stronger than you thought? What if this challenge became an opportunity to learn something important about yourself?" Mrs. Chen's questions helped Sarah realize that her fear of failure was based on assumptions about what failure would mean. The worst-case scenario was public embarrassment, which was painful but not permanent. The best-case scenario was discovering capabilities she didn't know she possessed. That evening, Sarah's father came home to find her doing push-ups in the living room, using a modified technique that accommodated her cast. She had decided that if she was going to face Jake's physical challenges, she should at least prepare as much as possible. "Planning for tomorrow?" he asked, settling into his favorite chair to watch her exercise. "Trying to," Sarah replied between repetitions. "I'm not sure what I've gotten myself into." "You've gotten yourself into a leadership situation," her father said. "Whether you realize it or not, you've positioned yourself as someone who's willing to stand up for principles rather than accept easy solutions." Sarah paused in her exercise routine, not sure she understood what he meant. "Think about it, Mija. You could have asked teachers to intervene. You could have changed schools. You could have waited for your cast to come off and hoped the problem would go away. Instead, you chose to confront the situation directly, even when you knew the odds were against you. But what if I lose? Then, you'll have lost while standing up for yourself instead of hiding. There's honor in that, regardless of the outcome." Sarah's father stood up and moved to the window that looked out over the base. In the distance, they could see Marines conducting evening training exercises, their movements precise and coordinated. "You know what I tell young Marines when they're facing their first real test?" he said. "I tell them that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid." Thursday crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah found it almost impossible to concentrate on her classes, and several teachers noticed her distraction. The excitement among her fellow students was obvious, with groups gathering in hallways to discuss the upcoming confrontation and speculate about its outcome. Jake Morrison spent the day in his element, playing up his role as the confident champion who was about to put an upstart in her place. He made frequent references to the demonstration he had planned and the lesson Sarah was about to learn about her limitations. By 3:30, Sarah was standing outside the school building, trying to calm her nerves and prepare mentally for whatever awaited her behind the gym. She was surprised to see Maria and several of her other friends approaching, wearing expressions of determination that matched her own. "We're coming with you," Maria announced. "Whatever Jake has planned, you're not facing it alone." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude and affection for her friends. She had been so focused on her individual struggle with Jake that she had forgotten she didn't have to face this challenge in isolation. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This might get ugly." "That's exactly why we're coming," said David Chun, Mrs. Chen's grandson and one of Sarah's classmates. "Someone needs to make sure this stays fair." As they walked toward the gym, Sarah could see that word of the confrontation had spread far beyond her immediate social circle. Students were heading in the same direction from all parts of the campus, and she realized that Jake's demonstration was going to have a much larger audience than she had anticipated. Behind the gym, Jake had set up what could only be described as an obstacle course. There were stations for different types of physical challenges: push-ups, pull-ups, rope climbing, and various tests of coordination and agility. But what made Sarah's heart sink was the sight of Jake's backup. Standing beside him were 4 young men who were clearly not high school students. They were older, bigger, and had the kind of build and bearing that suggested military training. Sarah realized with growing dread that Jake had recruited Marines from the base to help him demonstrate what real strength looked like. The crowd of watching students had grown to more than 50 people, creating a large circle around the makeshift competition area. Sarah could feel their anticipation and excitement, but She could also sense that many of them were expecting to witness her humiliation rather than a fair competition. Jake stepped forward as Sarah approached, his confidence evident in every movement. "Glad you decided to show up, Martinez," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "I was starting to think you might have realized you were in over your head." "I'm here," Sarah replied simply, trying to project more calm than she actually felt. Jake gestured toward his companions. "Let me introduce you to some friends of mine. These guys are Marines from the base, and they've agreed to help demonstrate what real physical capability looks like." Sarah's father had taught her to assess tactical situations quickly, and she immediately understood that Jake had structured this confrontation to be unwinnable for her. She wasn't just competing against Jake anymore. She was expected to measure herself against trained military personnel while dealing with a significant physical limitation. But as she studied the faces of Jake's Marine allies, she noticed something that gave her a small spark of hope. They looked uncomfortable with the situation they found themselves in. These were professional warriors who had been recruited to help a teenager bully a girl with a broken arm, and their expressions suggested they weren't entirely proud of their role. "So here's how this works," Jake announced to the crowd. "We're going to run through a series of physical challenges. Martinez thinks she can compete despite her obvious limitations, so we're going to give her every opportunity to prove herself." The first challenge was push-ups, which Jake had obviously chosen because it would require Sarah to support her body weight partially on her injured arm. He demonstrated first, executing 50 perfect repetitions while the crowd counted along. His Marine allies followed, each easily matching or exceeding his performance. When it was Sarah's turn, she dropped into position and modified her stance to accommodate her cast. The first few repetitions were manageable, but by the 10th push-up, she could feel the strain on her injured arm becoming significant. The weight of the cast made it difficult to maintain proper form, and she could hear some members of the crowd beginning to murmur about her obvious struggles. By the 20th repetition, Sarah was grimacing with effort and pain. Her left arm was trembling with fatigue, and she knew she couldn't continue much longer. At 25 push-ups, she collapsed to the ground, her strength completely depleted. Jake stood over her with obvious satisfaction. 25, he announced to the crowd. Not bad for someone with limited capabilities. The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah could hear some nervous laughter from the watching students. She had known this would be difficult, but the reality of public failure was more humiliating than she had anticipated. The second challenge was pull-ups on a bar that Jake had set up between two pieces of gym equipment. Again, he demonstrated first, executing 15 smooth repetitions before dropping to the ground with barely increased breathing. His Marine companions followed with similarly impressive performances. When Sarah approached the bar, she knew immediately that this challenge would be impossible. Pull-ups required the use of both hands working together, and her cast made it impossible to maintain a proper grip. She managed to hang from the bar for several seconds before dropping down without completing a single repetition. 0, Jake announced, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. But, hey, hanging there for a few seconds was a good effort. The crowd's laughter was more open now, and Sarah could feel her face burning with embarrassment. She was beginning to understand that Jake had designed this entire event not as a fair competition, but as a public demonstration of her limitations. The third challenge involved rope climbing, which was even more impossible than the pull-ups. Sarah couldn't grip the rope properly with her cast, and she barely managed to pull herself a few inches off the ground before sliding back down. With each failed attempt, Jake's commentary became more pointed, and the crowd's reaction more openly mocking. Sarah could see that some of her friends looked uncomfortable with what was happening, but they seemed powerless to intervene without making the situation worse. By the time they reached the fourth challenge, Sarah was feeling completely defeated. She had proven nothing except that Jake was right about her limitations. The entire school would remember this as the day she had foolishly challenged someone stronger than herself and been publicly humiliated for her arrogance. But it was during the fourth challenge that something unexpected happened. Jake had set up a test of coordination and balance that involved navigating through a series of obstacles while maintaining control of a basketball. It was designed to showcase agility and athletic skill rather than raw strength. As Jake demonstrated the course, dribbling the basketball smoothly through the obstacles, one of his Marine allies stepped closer to Sarah. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was a friend of her father's, and she had known him since childhood. "Sarah," he said quietly, so that only she could hear, "what the hell are you doing here?" "Trying to prove I'm not weak," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't proving anything except that Morrison is a coward who needs backup to pick on a girl with a broken arm, Rodriguez said with disgust. We thought we were coming to watch a fair competition, not a public humiliation. Sarah looked up at him with surprise. She had assumed that the Marines were there to support Jake's efforts to embarrass her. Listen to me, Rodriguez continued urgently. Your father is one of the best Marines I've ever served with, and, from what I've heard, you've got the same fighting spirit. Don't let this punk define what strength means. Before Sarah could respond, it was her turn to attempt the coordination challenge. She stepped up to the starting line with the basketball, knowing that this would likely be another public failure, but determined to at least complete the attempt. What happened next surprised everyone, including Sarah herself. The coordination challenge didn't require the kind of brute strength that had made the earlier tests impossible for her. Instead, it required balance, timing, and spatial awareness, skills that her weeks of adapting to life with one hand had actually improved. She navigated through the obstacles smoothly, using her left hand to control the basketball while her right arm, cast, and all helped her maintain balance. Her movements were different from Jake's, more careful and deliberate, but they were also more efficient. When she completed the course, the crowd was silent for a moment before breaking into surprised applause. Sarah had not only succeeded at the challenge, she had completed it faster than Jake had. Jake's face showed his confusion and anger at this unexpected turn of events. He had planned for Sarah to fail at every challenge, providing him with a series of opportunities to mock her limitations. Her success at the coordination test was disrupting his narrative. Lucky break, he said dismissively. Let's see how you handle something that requires real strength. But Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward before Jake could set up another challenge. Hold on, he said in the kind of authoritative voice that made everyone in the area stop what they were doing. I think we need to talk about what's really happening here. The crowd went completely silent as Rodriguez addressed them directly. I came here today because Morrison told me he wanted to organize a friendly competition between students. What I'm seeing instead is a setup designed to humiliate someone who's already dealing with an injury. Jake's face reddened. This is what she asked for. She challenged me. She challenged you to a fair competition, Rodriguez replied. What you've organized is 4 healthy people ganging up on someone with a disability. There's nothing honorable about that. Rodriguez turned to address the crowd of students. You want to see what real strength looks like? It's not about being able to do more push-ups than someone with a broken arm. Real strength is what Martinez has been showing for the past month, adapting to challenges, finding new ways to accomplish goals, and refusing to let limitations define her worth. The other 3 Marines were nodding in agreement, their expressions showing that they shared Rodriguez's assessment of the situation. As far as I'm concerned, Rodriguez continued, Martinez has already won this competition by having the courage to show up. Morrison, on the other hand, has shown that he needs 3 other people to help him feel superior to a girl with a cast. Jake looked around desperately for support, but his carefully planned demonstration had completely collapsed. The crowd's sympathy had shifted to Sarah, and his own allies were openly criticizing his methods. This isn't over, Jake said angrily, but his words lacked conviction. Yes, it is, Rodriguez replied firmly. And if I hear about any more harassment, you'll be dealing with me directly. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by her friends and several students she barely knew, all offering congratulations and support. The day that had begun as her potential humiliation had somehow transformed into a victory she never could have anticipated. But even as she accepted the congratulations, Sarah knew that the real test was still ahead of her. Jake Morrison's public embarrassment would not make him disappear, and his anger at being challenged by a Marine would likely make him even more dangerous. The game had changed, but it was far from over. The weekend following the confrontation behind the gym passed in an unusual calm that Sarah found more unsettling than reassuring. Jake Morrison seemed to have disappeared from her daily experience entirely, no longer appearing at her locker or making his usual mocking comments in the hallways. For the first time in months, Sarah could move through her school day without constantly looking over her shoulder or bracing herself for the next verbal assault. Her friends were celebrating what they saw as a complete victory over Jake's bullying campaign. Maria and the others talked excitedly about how Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had publicly humiliated Jake and effectively ended his reign of terror. They seemed to believe that the problem was solved and that life could return to normal. But Sarah's father had taught her to be suspicious of enemies who retreated too quickly and too completely. In his experience, tactical withdrawals were often preludes to more serious attacks, and the sudden absence of pressure usually meant that pressure was building somewhere else. Monday morning brought confirmation of Sarah's instincts. Jake Morrison was indeed absent from her daily routine, but he had not simply given up his campaign against her. Instead, he had expanded it beyond the boundaries of school property and direct confrontation. The first sign of trouble came during lunch period, when Maria approached Sarah's table with a troubled expression and her phone in her hand. "Sarah, you need to see this," she said, sitting down heavily beside her friend. The phone screen displayed a social media post that made Sarah's stomach clench with dread. Someone had created a fake profile using her name and photos, and was posting content designed to make her look foolish and desperate. The posts included exaggerated stories about her injury, fictional accounts of her begging for help with simple tasks, and doctored photos that made her cast appear even more prominent and cumbersome. "There are more," Maria said quietly, scrolling through additional posts. "Someone's been really busy this weekend." The fake profile had already gained dozens of followers, many of whom were commenting with the kind of cruel mockery that Jake had previously delivered in person. But now the harassment had a permanent digital presence that could reach far beyond their immediate school community. "It gets worse," Maria continued, navigating to another platform. "Look at this." Someone had also created a fake video that appeared to show Sarah struggling with basic tasks and asking for help in an exaggerated, whining voice. The video had been skillfully edited to make her appear pathetic and helpless, and it was already being shared among students from their school and others in the district. Sarah stared at the phone screen in shock. The digital assassination of her character was more comprehensive and damaging than anything Jake had done in person. These posts would remain online indefinitely, potentially affecting her reputation for years to come. "We have to report this," Maria said. "This is cyberbullying, and it's probably illegal." Sarah appreciated her friend's immediate desire to help, but she also understood that reporting the fake profiles would likely be ineffective. The posts could be taken down, but new ones could be created faster than they could be removed. More importantly, involving school administrators or police would escalate the conflict in ways that might make it even more difficult to resolve. "Let me think about this," Sarah said, handing the phone back to Maria. "I need to understand what we're really dealing with before we decide how to respond." After school, Sarah walked home with her mind racing through possible responses to Jake's digital campaign. The fake profiles were sophisticated enough that they had probably required help from someone with more technical skills than Jake possessed. This suggested that he had recruited allies with capabilities beyond simple physical intimidation. Mrs. Chun was waiting for her in the building's lobby, holding a package that had been delivered to Sarah's apartment. But instead of simply handing over the package, Mrs. Chun gestured for Sarah to sit with her on the lobby bench. "I've been hearing things from other parents about some problems you're having online," Mrs. Chun said gently. Sarah was surprised that news of the fake profiles had already reached the adult community, but she supposed that military-based communities were small enough that information traveled quickly between families. "It's just some stupid posts," Sarah said, trying to minimize the situation. "It'll blow over." Mrs. Chun smiled with the kind of knowing expression that suggested she understood more about the situation than Sarah realized. "My dear, I've been dealing with bullies and predators for more than 60 years. I recognize escalation when I see it." She reached into her purse and withdrew her own phone, showing Sarah a screenshot of one of the fake profiles. "This isn't just stupid posts," Mrs. Chin continued. "This is a coordinated attack on your reputation and character. It's designed to isolate you from your support network and make you feel helpless to defend yourself." Sarah looked at the screenshot with growing concern. If adults in the community were seeing these posts, the damage to her reputation could extend far beyond her immediate social circle. "What do I do?" she asked. Mrs. Chin put her phone away and studied Sarah's face with the kind of penetrating attention that made her feel like all of her thoughts were visible. "Tell me, what do you think Jake Morrison wants to accomplish with this campaign?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "He wants to humiliate me, to prove that he's stronger and that I was wrong to challenge him." Deeper than that, Mrs. Chun pressed. "What does he need to feel secure in his own identity?" The question forced Sarah to think about Jake's motivations in a way she hadn't before. He needs to feel superior to other people. He needs to prove that he's in control. Exactly. And what would happen to his sense of control if his campaign against you failed to achieve its intended effect? Sarah began to see where Mrs. Chun was leading her. He would have to escalate further, or he would have to find a different target. Or Mrs. Chun said with a meaningful look. He would have to face the possibility that his methods don't actually give him the control he thinks they do. That evening, Sarah sat in her room staring at her phone and thinking about Mrs. Chin's questions. The fake profiles were still active, still accumulating followers and comments. With each passing hour, more students from her school were seeing the posts and forming opinions about her based on fabricated content. The temptation to respond directly to the posts was almost overwhelming. She wanted to comment on each fake profile, explaining that they weren't real and that the content was malicious fiction. But she also understood that engaging with the fake profiles would likely make the situation worse, providing Jake with evidence that his campaign was achieving its intended effect. Around 9 o'clock, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief, but chilling. "This is just the beginning. You should have stayed in your place." Sarah stared at the message for several minutes before showing it to her father. Sergeant Major Rodriguez read the text twice before setting the phone down with a grim expression. "This has gone beyond school bullying," he said. "This is harassment, and it's escalating. What should I do? First, we're going to document everything. Screenshots, saved copies, timestamps. If this continues to escalate, we'll need evidence." Her father stood up and began pacing the small living room, his expression showing the kind of focused attention he brought to serious tactical problems. "Second, we're going to talk to Rodriguez and the other Marines who were at that competition. If Jake is behind this, he's crossed a line that they won't tolerate." "But I don't want this to become a bigger drama," Sarah protested. "I just want it to stop." "I understand that, Mija. But sometimes problems don't stop until people face real consequences for their actions." Tuesday morning brought a new development that shifted the entire dynamic of the situation. Sarah arrived at school to find Jake Morrison standing at her locker, but his usual confident swagger had been replaced by obvious agitation and anger. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. Sarah looked around cautiously, noting that several other students were watching the interaction with interest. Jake's public humiliation the previous week had made any conversation between them a source of entertainment for their classmates. "What do you want, Jake?" "I want you to call off your military friends," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Sarah was confused by his request. "What are you talking about? Don't play stupid with me. Your dad's Marine buddies came to my house last night. They had a very interesting conversation with my father about online harassment and consequences." Sarah felt a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. She had no idea that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez and the other Marines had taken it upon themselves to investigate Jake's digital campaign. But she wasn't sorry that they had. "I don't know anything about that," she said honestly. "Right? And I suppose you don't know anything about the fact that every fake profile I created has been reported and taken down either." Sarah's heart leaped with relief. The fake profiles were gone, which meant that at least the immediate damage to her reputation could be contained. "Look, Morrison," she said, using his last name deliberately to maintain distance between them. "I don't control what other people decide to do. If you're having problems with Marines, maybe you should think about why that might be." Jake's face reddened with frustration. He was clearly accustomed to being able to intimidate his targets, and Sarah's calm response was not giving him the satisfaction he expected. "This isn't over," he said, echoing his words from the previous week. "Actually, I think it is," Sarah replied. "Unless you want to explain to Staff Sergeant Rodriguez why you're still harassing me after he specifically told you to stop." Jake looked around nervously, apparently realizing that their conversation was attracting attention from other students and potentially from teachers. Without another word, he stalked away from her locker, his entire body radiating anger and frustration. Sarah felt a surge of triumph as she watched him leave. For the first time since her injury, she felt like she had gained the upper hand in their conflict. Jake's digital campaign had been neutralized, and his ability to harass her at school had been severely limited by adult intervention. But her triumph was short-lived. During lunch period, Maria approached her table with news that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Jake's been talking to people," Maria said urgently. "He's claiming that you set him up, that you got him in trouble with the military on false pretenses." "That's ridiculous," Sarah said. "I didn't even know the Marines had talked to him until he told me this morning." "I know that, and you know that, but Jake's got some people convinced that you're more manipulative than you appear. He's saying you played the victim to get powerful allies to fight your battles for you." Sarah realized that Jake was attempting to reframe the entire conflict, portraying himself as the real victim of an unfair campaign orchestrated by Sarah and her military connections. It was a clever strategy that played on people's sympathy for underdogs and their suspicion of authority figures. There's more, Maria continued. He's been recruiting people who have their own problems with military families. You know how some of the civilian kids resent the influence that base families have in the community. Sarah understood immediately what Maria was describing. The relationship between the military base and the surrounding civilian community was complex, with some local families feeling that military families receive preferential treatment in schools and local businesses. Jake was attempting to turn her military connections from an advantage into a liability. That afternoon, as Sarah walked home from school, she noticed that she was being followed by two students she didn't recognize. They maintained a careful distance, but they were clearly tracking her movements. When she stopped to check her phone, they stopped as well. When she resumed walking, they followed. The realization that Jake had recruited people to intimidate her outside of school grounds was deeply unsettling. The conflict that had begun as verbal harassment between classmates was evolving into something that felt much more serious and potentially dangerous. Sarah quickened her pace, but she didn't run. Her father had taught her that showing fear to predators often encouraged more aggressive behavior. Instead, she maintained an appearance of calm while carefully noting details about her followers that she could report if necessary. When she reached her apartment building, the two students continued past without stopping, but their message had been clearly delivered. Jake's campaign against her was not limited to school hours or school property. She was now a target whenever she was visible in the community. That evening, Sarah told her father about the day's events. Sergeant Major Rodriguez listened with growing concern as she described Jake's attempts to reframe their conflict and the intimidating behavior of his new allies. "This is escalating beyond what I'm comfortable with," he said. "We may need to involve school administrators and possibly base security." "But that will just prove Jake's point about me hiding behind authority figures," Sarah protested. "No, Mija, it will prove that we take threats to your safety seriously. There's a difference between fighting your own battles and putting yourself in unnecessary danger." Sarah understood her father's concerns, but she also felt that involving more adults would fundamentally change the nature of her conflict with Jake. Instead of proving that she could stand up for herself, she would be demonstrating that she needed protection from others. "Give me a little more time," she requested. "Let me see if I can find a way to resolve this without escalating it further." Her father looked skeptical, but he nodded slowly. "A little more time. But if this gets any worse, we're bringing in help whether you like it or not." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the trajectory of her conflict with Jake Morrison. What had begun as simple mockery of her temporary disability had evolved into a sophisticated campaign involving digital harassment, social manipulation, and physical intimidation. Each time she had successfully defended herself against one type of attack, Jake had responded by escalating to more serious methods. She was beginning to understand that Jake's behavior was not really about her broken hand at all. Her injury had simply provided him with an excuse to target someone he saw as vulnerable. Now that she had proven herself capable of fighting back, he had revealed his true nature as someone who needed to dominate others in order to feel secure about himself. The question was whether she could find a way to end this cycle of escalation before it led to consequences that neither of them could control. Sarah was discovering that sometimes winning meant more than just proving you were strong enough to fight. Sometimes it meant being smart enough to choose when and how to end a fight on your own terms. But, as she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jake Morrison was not the type of person who would accept defeat gracefully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she would need to be ready for whatever form his desperation might take. Wednesday arrived with an ominous tension that seemed to permeate the entire school. Sarah could feel it in the way conversations stopped when she walked past groups of students, in the nervous energy that crackling through the hallways, and in the way teachers seemed more alert than usual, as if they sensed that something significant was about to happen. Jake Morrison had spent Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning actively recruiting allies for what he was calling a final resolution of his conflict with Sarah. Word had spread through certain social circles that Jake felt humiliated by the intervention of Sarah's military connections and was planning to prove that he didn't need adult protection to handle his problems. The recruitment had been surprisingly successful. Jake had managed to convince several students that Sarah represented everything they resented about military families on the base: privilege, protection from consequences, and unfair advantages in community conflicts. He had also attracted followers who simply enjoyed the prospect of witnessing or participating in a dramatic confrontation. By lunchtime, Sarah was aware that something was being planned, though she didn't know exactly what form it would take. The nervous energy among students was palpable, and several of her friends had heard rumors about Jake organizing some kind of group action against her. Maybe you should go home sick, Maria suggested as they sat in the cafeteria. Whatever Jake is planning, it's not going to be good. Sarah considered the suggestion, but she also understood that avoiding the confrontation would only postpone it while giving Jake more time to organize and plan. Her father had taught her that sometimes the best tactical response to an inevitable conflict was to engage on your own terms rather than waiting for the enemy to choose the time and place. No, she said finally. If Jake wants a confrontation, we might as well get it over with. After lunch, Sarah was walking to her next class when she noticed that the hallways seemed unusually empty. Students who should have been moving between classes were nowhere to be seen, and the few people she did encounter avoided making eye contact. The absence of normal activity was more unsettling than any direct threat would have been. She was approaching the intersection of two major hallways when she saw them. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the corridor, flanked by 6 other students who formed a loose semicircle that blocked Sarah's path forward. The group included the 2 students who had followed her home the previous day, along with several others she recognized as part of Jake's expanding alliance. But what made Sarah's heart race was the realization that this confrontation was happening in full view of the main office and several classrooms. Jake had chosen the most public location possible for whatever he had planned, which suggested that he wanted maximum exposure for Sarah's humiliation. Well, Jake said loudly, his voice echoing off the lockers and classroom doors. Look who decided to show up for the final lesson. Sarah stopped walking but didn't retreat. She could see that several teachers had noticed the gathering and were moving toward the intersection, but she also understood that adult intervention might not arrive quickly enough to prevent whatever Jake had planned. What do you want, Morrison? She asked, her voice carrying clearly through the hallway. I want to settle this once and for all, Jake replied. You've been hiding behind your military connections long enough. It's time to find out what you're really made of without Daddy's Marine friends protecting you. Sarah could see students beginning to emerge from classrooms and gather at the edges of the corridor. Word was spreading quickly that the long-anticipated confrontation between Sarah Martinez and Jake Morrison was finally happening. I'm not hiding behind anyone, Sarah said calmly. And I'm not afraid of you. Jake smiled with the kind of cruel satisfaction that suggested he had been hoping for exactly that response. Prove it, he said. Right here, right now? Let's see if you're as tough as you think you are. The challenge was unmistakable, and Sarah could feel the attention of dozens of students focused on her response. This was the moment that would define how she was remembered at this school, and possibly how she saw herself for years to come. But as Sarah looked at Jake and his 6 allies, she realized that something fundamental had changed in her understanding of what strength really meant. The girl who had been devastated by mockery of her broken hand was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to see challenges as opportunities for growth rather than threats to her identity. You want to know what I'm made of? Sarah asked, her voice steady and clear. Fine, but let's make this interesting. Jake's expression showed surprise at her calm acceptance of his challenge. He had expected her to back down or to call for adult intervention, not to engage on his terms. What did you have in mind? He asked cautiously. Sarah smiled, and for the first time in their long conflict, Jake seemed uncertain about what was coming next. You brought 6 people to help you fight one girl with a broken hand, she said, her voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear clearly. That doesn't seem like a fair test of anyone's strength. Murmurs rippled through the crowd of watching students. Sarah's observation had highlighted something that many of them